it is about holiness as a concept. And so it's not the knight himself who represents holiness, but we're seeing holiness played out across the various episodes of the thing. And that allows Spenser to make different types of statements. You can say different sorts of things in an allegorical text than you could say in an allegory. And so for them, allegory means a story. Allegory is based on the Greek word allos, which means other. And so it's a story where all of the aspects of the story means something else.
Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. This is a show all about ideas, about how we can rebuild a collapsing culture. My guests all have the credentials, the wisdom, the experience to say something meaningful, to contribute to the rebuilding of our moment. Season 9 is going to be our best season yet. Enjoy. Today, I am joined by Dr. Junius Johnson. He is a scholar of theology, philosophy, and literature with degrees from Oral Roberts University, Yale Divinity School, and a PhD in philosophical theology from Yale University. He served as lecturer in ecclesiastical Latin at Yale Divinity School, assistant professor of historical theology at Baylor University, and is now the executive director of Junius Johnson Academics. I met Junius at this summer's ACCS conference, and I'm delighted to get to talk to him today about Edmund Spenser's beautiful poem, The Faerie Queene. Junius, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm particularly excited because I think we were back-to-back guest with David Bates on Pints with Jack at the end of last season.
That's right. You told me that. Yeah.
And I was just like, I had listened to your episode and heard how excited you were about Lewis. And then I got to meet you at the conference. I was like, oh, and then turns out you had just been teaching the Faerie Queene. I was like, we have got to sit down together.
Yeah, right.
Well, so I find it I always find it interesting to meet other people who've read Spenser, because my advisor told me this when I first suggested we do a Spenser tutorial. No one really reads Spenser today. I've since seen Spenser listed on a couple of syllabi, but it's almost always only book 1, if anything. Mm-hmm. It might just be like excerpts from book 1. So why does nobody read the Faerie Queene, and why should people read the Faerie Queene?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 obvious reasons why people don't read the Faerie Queene. One of them is blaringly obvious, and that is best shown visually. It's just really big, really long, right? I mean, in this edition, this is the Penguin. The text ends on page around page 1050 something. So, that's hard. That's a long slog if you're just adding it to your personal reading list. But it's also, if you're trying to put it on a syllabus, I mean, who's got time just to read all the Faerie Queene on a syllabus? So that's a big deal. But then the other thing I think is, although less immediately obvious, really crucial and really decisive. And that is that I've come to find that it is characteristic of the modern ages that they don't like allegory. And you see this, I'm not going to point to someone like, Hemingway or somebody like this that it's really fun to kind of dump on as being the destroyers of the enchantment of the world. I'm going to point to people who are really, have a wonderfully enchanted vision of the world. Lewis and Tolkien. Tolkien did not like allegory. He very much, he talked about this even at the introduction to the Lord of the Rings, how he finds it a very kind of, plodding sort of literary form. Lewis does, and this is one of the reasons Lewis is superior to Tolkien, is that Lewis does like allegory. However, he's also, he doesn't go in for it that much. He doesn't write it. The only real allegory he wrote was the allegory of love. But when you look at things like the Cosmic Trilogy or the Narnia tales, they're explicitly non-allegorical. I'm not here to say that, to blame these guys for not writing The Lord of the Rings or Narnia as allegories. I don't think everything should be an allegory, but I love allegory. And Spenser was writing at a time when everyone still loved allegory. And so as exciting as what literally happens in the Faerie Queene was what it represented and the ways that he was able to comment on the virtues and human society and all this other sort of a thing. That's kind of stuff is, only, stodgy scholars like us are interested in that sort of a thing these days. And so part of it is a need to rehabilitate allegory if people are going to get into this form again.
Well, so I already feel a need to ask you to define the term because in part, I mean, I know I always look at those passages of both Tolkien and Lewis and think, I know you're saying you don't like allegory, but I don't believe you.
It's right.
Because could there be a better allegory or at least a picture of friendship than Frodo and Sam?
Yeah.
Could there be a better depiction of sort of an allegory of girlhood and school than Lucy standing there at the spell book, listening in on her friends, and then having the consequences of her eavesdropping made manifest by Aslan? But they both say they're not allegorical, and I don't want to say they're lying, but I think they have a certain view of allegory in mind. So it's that Spenser is not really, he's by no means a simple allegory author. So what do you mean by allegory? And maybe is that distinct from other authors' use of allegory?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. For Lewis and Tolkien, they have the technical meaning of allegory in mind. They're both literature professors. And so for them, allegory means a story. Allegory is based on the Greek word allos, which means other. And so it's a story where all of the aspects of the story mean something else. Sometimes in this way contemporary folks will talk about it, will say that an allegory is a one-to-one, right? And the easiest and probably still best known example of this maybe is the Pilgrim's Progress, where, Pilgrim leaves the city of destruction. The city of destruction represents this world. Christian represents a person who's going to become a Christian. He goes to the Slough of Despond, which represents spiritual depression, and you can sort of go through and just sort of identify everything that's happening there. That's their sense of what allegory is. And they're thinking about this text, the Faerie Queene. They're thinking about the Romance of the Rose, the great medieval allegory of sexual conquest, and things of that sort. So they wouldn't deny, and Lewis actually explicitly affirms in some of his letters that Narnia is not only symbolic, but even has very specific symbolism that he intends, right? He goes through in one letter, he explains that each book of the Chronicles of Narnia corresponds to a different aspect of the Christian life. And he says what those are for each of the 7 books. So that's not allegory. That's just symbolism, right? Or if Michael Ward is right about, the whole Planet Narnia stuff, which, I love Michael, he's fantastic, but I think he's found something that was implicit in how Lewis thought rather than a structure Lewis was intentionally trying to follow. But if he is right, that also would not be an allegory. That would still just be symbolic resonance and the thematic associations and that sort of a thing. So when Tolkien denies that the Lord of the Rings is an allegory in the introduction to, I guess, the second edition of the Lord of the Rings, what he's talking about is people who are asking him, isn't this meant to represent World War II? And then they go through and they look at Frodo and Sam's journey, well, all of the journey of the characters, but in the ring's progress and the ring itself, and the ring is the atom bomb. And then they're talking about how, this is the progress, and you can start associating each of the different places with different aspects of the war. And Tolkien says, well, no, it's obviously not an allegory for that, because if it were, these aspects would have to be different in order for the allegory to correspond to the real world. So I'm with you. I think that they are they love symbolism, and they love they love themes. And so they love being able to make, in a sense, it is an allos discourse, because they are talking about something else at the same time they're talking about the story, but they're not trying to primarily use the story to talk about something else, right?
Well, let's take this back to Spenser then, because if we've got, hopefully our audience has all read Pilgrim's Progress, whether in the original or some children's adaptation. But that's clearly different than what Spenser's doing in terms of allegory. I mean, I think maybe one way to conceptualize that, if Bunyan is 1-to-1, Spenser might be like 1-12 or something like that. Like, what's Spenser's approach to allegory?
Yeah, and I kind of feel like there's a distinction that I'll make in theology that I think could be helpful here as well. I would, for example, we talk about sacraments. And so there's a sacrament is like the Lord's Supper, or it's like baptism, or whatever the case may be. And then you get to talking to some folks and they'll say, well, but a tree can be a sacrament if you have this powerful, it can mediate the presence of God to you and this sort of a thing. And I want to say, I see what you're getting at, and I agree with what you're getting at, but we need to be more careful about the language, because to be a sacrament is not merely it's not just a physical thing where I encounter God. Because, in that sense, everything would be a sacrament. But rather, a sacrament is something that is instituted by the Lord to be a regular place where Christians can reliably encounter certain aspects of the divine grace. When I see a tree, I may or may not experience the divine presence. When I get baptized, I definitely get baptized. There's no question about the grace being conferred there. And I think that, so then I'll say that, okay, so, you know, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, same thing, the Eucharist and baptism, these things are sacraments. The tree can be sacramental, right?
Okay.
That is to say, it partakes of the logic of the sacrament without itself being a sacrament. I think something like that kind of a distinction could help us here with Spenser as well. That the Faerie Queene is not, properly speaking, an allegory, rather it's allegorical. And so there are a lot of things that happen, and what the payoff is for that. This is actually very, I think, felicitous for contemporary readers, because we do struggle with allegories. It feels forced to us. What this does is it provides the same satisfaction of recognizing, oh, wow, this scene really shows what it's like when politics trumps the administration of justice, or whatever the thing is. But you don't feel like what's literally happening just has to kind of get thrown away or recede into the background so you can focus on what it means. Instead, Spenser allows us to delight in what is, at base, it's fundamentally a fairy story, right? And we get to enjoy the literal level of it. And some things happen at the literal level that don't necessarily play into the allegorical meaning of it. But we also get that allegorical meaning where we can dive deeper and see how, wow, this is a really great example of, you know, the dynamics of friendship or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. And as you were describing that, I was thinking of a place where I think I kind of felt that that realization, like, oh, this, I get this image in a way. Was at it's in book 1 after Redcrosse has been rescued from the dungeon. He is given into pride, and he's followed Duessa. And we eventually realize that Duessa is the image of the false church. He should have been with Una, the one true church, the whole time. But Una has to rescue him from this really fascinating feminine figure who is actually like, she's wildly disordered, and Spenser kind of sets her up as like, this woman should never be in charge of this man, and yet she is abusing him. And it's ripe for feminine analysis, but that's really beside the point. Redcrosse is rescued from prison, and then he heals in a seminary, the House of Holiness. And it's that time in the House of Holiness that really transforms him into the, hopefully there's our readers or our listeners are okay with spoilers for a poem that's 500 years old. But I mean, it's then that the poem reveals this has been Knight George who's about to fight the dragon. Like,
yeah,
but it's he has to kind of go through this time of discipleship. And on the one hand, I really like that distinction of allegorical versus allegory, because the whole thing is allegorical. It's showing the preparation of the soul before you can really triumph against the forces of evil is really a course of discipleship. And it's going to be this mix of persons and institutions, and then submitting to those. And there are certain habits that have to be learned, but it's not as simple as Christian must fight against the giant of pride or whatever Bunyan would do. It's far more complicated than that. But you get this much richer sense that this does correspond to the way the world works, and that human life in the world works.
Yeah, and I think that, a great example. This ties in with something that I always bring up when I'm teaching book 1 of the Faerie Queene, is that according to the heading of the book, this is the Knight of Holiness. So in a proper allegory, the Redcrosse Knight would be holiness. And it would make no sense for him to go to the House of Holiness and become holy there. that wrecks it, right? But because it's not a proper allegory, like, no, it's really, it is about holiness as a concept. And so it's not the knight himself who represents holiness, but we're seeing holiness played out across the various episodes of the thing. And that allows Spenser to make different types of statements. You can say different sorts of things in an allegorical text than you could say in an allegory. For example, King Arthur, who is one of the most important and interesting figures of the thing. And he represents, what does Arthur represent? Most of the knights get named, this one is friendship and this one is chastity and blah, 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 but Arthur doesn't. And Arthur's the one who's destined to marry the Faerie Queene at the end of the work, if we had gotten to the end of the work, which is the central tragedy of, our existence, is that Spenser didn't get any further. But But why? So because Arthur represents the dream of a united Britain. He represents the union of the Britain heritage and the Anglo-Saxon heritage and the Norman heritage and all of that stuff. And then he's going to unite the realm of Britain, which as the text progresses, we really realize it's a different place than Fairyland, that Britain and Fairyland will be united. And in a sense, that'll be the true Camelot when those two aspects are brought together. So Arthur does allegorically represent a certain vision of the best that Britain can be, but at the same time, he's freed up to be a character who doesn't have to, everything about how he acts and behaves and speaks doesn't have to be beholden to what he allegorically represents. And that allows him to breathe more and be a more full-on character, right?
Yeah, I think it makes it far more enjoyable because as soon as you're clued into the meaning, I mean, I think it's book 2 is dedicated to the book of Temperance, and I found myself like okay, I met this character. What does he have to do with temperance? As soon as I know there's that connection, I sort of am hunting for it. But it's far more, I think, enjoyable and helpful to really just kind of follow Arthur along and not worry about pigeonholing him into a certain virtue box.
That's right. And that's what I would say to anyone listening who is sort of asking themselves the question, do I want to take on this text? The allegorical dimension is absolutely there, but I think as someone who, I make my money teaching people the allegorical dimension of things, I don't think it's the most interesting part of the text. I think the most interesting part of the text is to read it as a fairy story. And so if you're like, oh, I don't know if I'd be, able to pick up on all the allegorical whatnot, I think what I would say to you is let her rip, man. Doesn't matter. Like, just enjoy the tale because crazy stuff's going to happen.
Well, I think Lewis would agree with that 100% because his advice when asked, how do I get into the Faerie Queene, was not to say, well, make sure you have all the footnotes and the accessory helps with you and you've got your reference books handy. He's like, no, find a good children's illustrated version of the Faerie Queene, one that the illustrator is really going to bring out the magic and the wonder and the mystery and the beauty that this poem evokes. And all the rest of it comes with time. But it's really just getting into it and getting into the story that I think is the main thing.
I think that's right. And on the heels of that, I will make this recommendation. When I taught this text this last time, I taught it using the new prose rendering that is coming out from Sky Turtle Press imminently. The books exist in the world and are now the question is when will they ship? And the goal, the woman who did this work just did a wonderful, wonderful job with it. And her goal was to make a version of the text that would be readable for high school students, that would be accessible, but that would be text faithful. And so she's keeping the content. I mean, it's the Faerie Queene. It's all there, and it's all 6 books, and the Mutability cantos. But it's rendered into a prose that makes it a bit more accessible. And the goal is to make you want to go back and read the original. And so as you get deeper into it, the prose starts to imitate Spenser's diction more and more. So by the time you get to books 4 and 5, you're starting to see a lot more. So it's training you for that kind of a thing. So I wasn't sure. I've taught the original text a number of times before, and students struggle with it to begin with. But once you read enough of it, you settle in and you get going. But it remains, it's going to be challenging throughout. There's going to be vocabulary challenges. There's going to be, diction challenges, word order things that are going to challenge the modern reader. So, again, if you're worried about that, or if you start reading it and you feel like, man, this is really kind of overwhelming, that new translation from the Sky Turtle Press, I think, is a really fantastic entry for folks into the poem and can help with making this poem feel, I don't want to make it feel contemporary because it should feel Renaissance, but the temporal foreignness of it can be such a high barrier that some people can't get over it. And this poem makes it feel more contemporary without doing violence to the text. And I think that's a welcome resource that we have.
I'm really glad you mentioned some of those textual barriers. I think that's another reason that people don't often read this, or that teachers don't easily put this on the syllabus, because if you go straight to the Faerie Queene, you've got yours handy if you want to find us a visual example, maybe. But the text is broken up into these Spenserian stanzas.
Yeah.
The edition I have at home.
I still show up at all.
No,
light on it.
right.
Yeah.
I might get my. I've got a student who edits these episodes for me. I might see if he can drop us a good image in right there.
Yeah.
So I'll leave a nice verbal cue to him if he wants to do that. But the version I've got at home has these Spenserian stanzas. But that version preserves as much of the original font that it was printed in as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to deal with the fact the letter F is always an S, which you think you can just mentally substitute. And it's just, you've got to always intentionally mentally substitute it.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I noticed the first time through is that the spelling is so much a modern convention that publishers have imposed on writers to some extent. And that even today, word processing programs impose a standardized spelling on all of us. Spenser's not worried about any of that. So he's got this very idiosyncratic way of spelling even the words that you know. And he's got a vast 16th century vocabulary, but he also is going to use words we still use, but he's going to spell them in wildly unique ways.
That's right. And in some ways, I love that stuff as someone who has studied the tradition that he's coming out of and can recognize a lot of the linguistic influences that he is representing by spelling plaisance and things like this. But, lacking that background, it can be tough. I realized, I discovered recently that I first read the Faerie Queene in college. It wasn't assigned to me. I was just reading stuff. I was sort of reading what Lewis was talking about. And so Lewis read it first when he was studying with the Great Knock. It's actually what he was reading right when he discovered Phantastes. So he was 17 and he had almost finished the Faerie Queene when he was on that day trip, and he was coming back, and he picked up Phantastes from the Everyman kiosk in the railroad station. Judging from how he talks about it, I think he was either in book 5 or book 6 at that point. He probably was about to start book 6 because the week after he read Phantastes, he finished the Faerie Queene. And so that's fascinating for me to see that that's kind of when he read it. And for me, I read it in college. So when I read it, I didn't know all the other stuff that goes into it now. I just had kind of, I was reading things. I was starting to learn some of that stuff, but I hadn't yet, had done a deep dive into medieval literature. I hadn't yet done a deep dive into Renaissance literature and that sort of a thing. And so for me, it was encountered primarily on the level of this is a story and this is what's happening. And I loved it. And I agreed with what Lewis said. He was, it was kind of strange to me to see him say, it's a shame it's not longer. But then when I got to the end of it, and this happened the last time that I read it as well, when I was teaching it this past spring, you get to the end of it and you're like, oh, that can't be it. I want more. Right. Because it's just so enjoyable while you're living in that world.
It really is. I want to come back to that ending, but we'll wait for that question. Talk to us a little bit about what it's like teaching the Faerie Queene. I mean, you mentioned teaching the original text and teaching a more modern adaptation. How do students respond to this?
Yeah. So first with the original text, I would teach this. I taught it several times when I was teaching at Baylor. And so it was a freshman course, the first course in the Great Text major. And it was a course called Introduction to Great Text, Here Be Dragons. And so we read a variety of texts that had dragons in them or that dealt with things to do with dragons, such as, Thomas Aquinas on fortitude, because if you're going to face a dragon, you might need some fortitude, right? And I've since taught a version of this course that strips away the things like Thomas Aquinas and Kant and just focuses on the literature. And the first time I did that, in the non-university setting, I taught book 1 of the Faerie Queene, but after student feedback from that first session, I dropped it and replaced it with something else. So the undergrads, undergrads are a special animal because you can really abuse them and get away with it because they just kind of think that, well, that's just the way life is. They don't know any better. And so they struggled very much with the text at first. And I warned them about that. And I said, listen, it's going to be hard at first, but just keep reading and just don't give up. And sure enough, by the time you get to about Canto 4 or so, it kind of locks in, and they're not struggling with it anymore. And then they're freed up to really talk about it. And they really enjoyed they really enjoyed the imagery. The thing that struck them all, right? It was never the, wow, look at how, you know, the serpent that represents deceit and its brood and all these other sorts of things. It was always like, man, that fight with the dragon was lit. And it is. And what's fun about that is when you have that buy-in to what's happening at the narrative level, that opens the door for those other conversations, right? We look at the final battle between George and the dragon. By the way, I'm going to score. I agree with you. I think that the statute of limitations on spoilers has passed.
Yep.
And so I think we're getting it clear. So, you know, this fight with the dragon where George is struck down twice, and each time he lands in a magical body of water that calls to mind baptism, and then rises again from that even stronger to face the battle with the dragon who represents Satan. And on the third day, he's able to finally cast him down, being newly risen from the dead. I mean, it's all right there. But it's kind of like is the difference between reading say a long arc of a Marvel comic and then reading a synopsis on Wikipedia of what took place over that arc. There's no story, no matter how great, that if you don't zoom out far enough, it doesn't start to look like a soap opera.
Yeah.
I mean, just the Odyssey is a great example of this, right? Then he goes over here, and then he goes over here, and then he gets in with this woman, and then he leaves and gets in with this woman, and it's just like, really, this is a great text. Like, what are we? But it's because the greatness is in the details. It's about how the story, right? The further you zoom out, the more distant you become from the story. You lose the emotional connection. You lose the organic interrelation of things, right? And so, getting into the details of it. You know, if I tell him saying what I just said, Redcrosse Knight is a Christ figure and blah, blah, then you're like, okay, whatever. I see why Tolkien didn't like allegory. But the students didn't have that response because they were coming from having journeyed with this knight, having seen that how he was deceived, knowing that he was deceived, being heartbroken with his deception, and then the struggles to win through and the ultimate battle and what he came through, they were there with him emotionally. And that was the proper context to begin talking about. And look how this images the journey of holiness. And look how holiness is grounded in the sacrifice of Christ and the blood of Christ and baptism and all that sort of a thing. So it went very well in the end with the undergraduates. As I said, with the adults, there was a bill pushback. They found it. They didn't adapt to the text as agilely as the undergrads did. And they didn't get swept up as a result. Probably they didn't get swept up in the story to the same degree that the undergrads did. And so for them, it remained a difficult exercise that was also, and this was kind of what won it over for me. It was too different from the other stories we were reading. Which are things like The Hobbit or Robert McKinley's Hero and the Crown, things like that. It was just too different from those things to really kind of fit in well for them. So this last time I taught it as part of a course called Forgotten Epics. And the idea was to read the great works that had shaped all major thinkers up till about, it's still true of Lewis that he was shaped by these works. And so all the way through the 60s, if you were educated, you knew these works, and you were in a tradition of people all the way back to the original publication that knew these works, right? But they just don't get read anymore. So we read the Battle of the Mice and the Frogs, the pseudo-Homeric mock epic of the Iliad, which was the first book printed in Greek in Europe because everyone was using it to learn Greek from it.
So that was called the Battle of the Mice and the Frogs?
We should say the Frogs and the Mice, Battle of the Frogs and the Mice. Yeah. And then we read the Argonautica, which doesn't get read anymore, Apollonius of Rhodes, and we read the Thebaid, and all these various sorts of, and the Faerie Queene was our penultimate text. And so, the type of person who signs up for a class like that, you're getting some good buy-in to begin with.
Yeah.
But multiple times while we were reading it, students would say to me, we have to do something to get this book back on the syllabus. Like, this is so good. We have to get this on the syllabus. Like, Dr. Johnson, do you realize that we have to get this on the syllabus? And I'm like, why do you think I'm teaching a class called Forgotten Epics? I'm doing my best. So even in both of those settings, that undergrad setting and then reading it in the context of we're reading great epic poetry, there was a great deal of buy-in, and there was a great deal of the response was, oh my gosh, this is really cool.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that idea. The response was like, okay, we gotta spread this. We gotta get more
Yeah.
people involved in reading Spenser. I want to ask you about a different part of Spenser because I mean, there's certainly, especially book one, it feels very fairy tale,
Mm.
there's really not a whole lot of dicey kind of adult content or adult content. The deeper you get into the Faerie Queene, the more Spenser's perfectly willing to play with harsher themes.
Hmm.
He's got rapacious satyrs running around in these woods. There's some really there's just a lot of interesting stuff, and I have a in my someday I want to go back to the Faerie Queene again and just try and pull out those specific sections and kind of lay them next to each other and be like, is Spenser saying something here about like human sexuality and sexual ethics through these different characters? But it's part of the fairy tale. I think when we look at fairy tales as moderns, as postmoderns, maybe we're very shaped by sort of fairy tales are for children, but this is a fairy tale very much for adults. So I want to ask you about kind of that side. Did you have any? Are there any parts of this like these themes, these scenes definitely hit people in a really unexpectedly kind of hard way, or is it all pretty smooth sailing as you go through the Faerie Queene?
Yeah, it's funny. As I was teaching this, my daughter noticed me reading this book, and she was like, "What are you reading?" And I said, "I'm reading the Faerie Queene," and she loves fairies. She's turning 9, and so she's like, "What? I want to read it." And I said, "Absolutely not," for like multiple reasons. But all could the level of the text, the difficulty of the language, the content presented, like no. And she's like, "When can I read it?" And I'm like, "Not for a really long time." And so that raised the question for me of when is the right time to read it. And this is that passage you alluded to from Lewis earlier when he's saying you should encounter it in a richly illustrated edition. I think the larger thing is something like, ideally every reader should read the Faerie Queene for the first time. I think he said around the age of 14 or 15 in a lovely illustrated edition, and this sort of a thing. And so I kind of took that and said, okay, like on the authority of Lewis, we can kind of visit this conversation again in 6 or 7 years. And part of the reason why it was a hard no for me is that there's a lot of sexual material in there. It's not pornographic. Let's just be very clear about that. It's not gratuitous in the sense of just shoehorning this stuff in. It's all quite related to the story he's telling. But that said, I do worry that it would be very easy to find it titillating. And so I do think for that reason, it's not appropriate to young readers. My adults, because we never read past book 1 with the undergrads. Okay. We just didn't have time to do more than that. And so they were cool. They were shielded from it. Although you do get some of that. Duessa in her temptress form is trying to pull some of that in, but it becomes a lot more explicit later. My adults were not really put off by it. And the thing is, they were prepared for, and I didn't intentionally prepare them for this, but they were prepared to encounter ideas that would not be modern, right? It's a Renaissance poem. Like he's going to have some ideas that would not be okay today. I mean, for goodness sake, Lewis is not yet, it's not yet been 100 years since Lewis died. And he says some things that wouldn't be okay today. So that, they were okay with that. And I think that's a testament to the fact that on the one hand, the steamy scenes are as much a part of the please the crowd thing as on the one hand violence is, and on the other hand as both of those things still are today. Right. So in an epic poem, as in a Hollywood blockbuster, you expect to see a lot of violent action, and you expect to see, romance and maybe a little, it's titillation going on. So he's definitely giving us that. He's working within the conventions. But I do think that it's a testament to the fact that it doesn't ever seem like he's just doing it just to fit it in there, that it always serves a larger purpose. And it's almost always, the result of it is almost always something negative.
Yeah, there's I'm thinking of, and there's also, I think there's part of what Spenser also does that he's so attentive to the different sides of very complex ideas. So maybe, for example, I'm thinking of the sisters Belphoebe and Amoret, where Amoret, you have to correct me if I get these mixed up because I haven't looked at the text in a couple of weeks, but I think Belphoebe is intended to be in the tradition of Diana, Yeah, where she's supposed to be this virginal huntress goddess figure. Amoret, however, is supposed to be, she's going to be married one day. She's going to have children. Spenser sets these both out as perfectly viable, comparable visions of femininity.
Yeah.
Where, like, on the one hand, you can have the virginal huntress, but you can also have, and then you can also have the mother. Both of these are part of the virtue of chastity.
Yeah.
And so it lets Spenser talk about, not really even talk about, it lets him show a non-sexual chastity, but also a marital chastity.
Yeah.
And he's going to, and that's, I think, particularly in a Protestant context, we don't refer very often to the virtue of chastity. We certainly don't. I cannot pinpoint a single moment in like teenage youth group days when we were going to have a sermon on marital chastity for everybody to think about when they're adults. Like, that was just not there at all. But Spenser sees that as a pretty valuable comparison to keep in mind. And that's a kind of a central subplot in, I think that's book 3. But then you get, anyway, go ahead.
I was going to say that. And also when it comes to Britomart, right? As she's an image of chastity, but what she's got to learn that, in a sense, she has to kind of have like a sexual awakening. She's got to learn that chastity for her is going to be marital chastity, and she kind of gets pushed against equating chastity with virginity, right? And so her journey towards, her falling in love with Athegall, and then some episodes that happen on the way to trying to find Athegall, make clear they also play with that same theme. And so then when Amoret comes under her power, when she's under her protection, right, and then there's this weird thing going on where Amoret thinks that she's a man and Britomart's not doing anything to allay that, and so Amoret's afraid that she's going to be required to do something sexually she doesn't want to do. And I'm like, Britomart, why are you doing this to her? Like, all you have to do is tell her you're a woman and like everything's good, but she's holding on to that. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of subtle interweaving of what those themes look like. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about the way that he handles the allegorical meaning of the text is that, and again, I think this is an aspect of it being allegorical and not an allegory. It frees him up to paint scenes that are much more complicated and they say more complicated things about chastity or about justice, for goodness sake, right? I mean,
my goodness.
Book 5 is nuts.
You got to tell me your thoughts on Athegall, because I'm just like, that dude would just kill everybody if he could. Like, I mean,
I've got thoughts
like
about
the
him.
Worst vision of like strong justice with no sight of mercy whatsoever.
Yeah, and William, let's talk about that for a second, right? Because he's got this robot dude that goes around with him, who is his executioner, and actually they start off kind of perfectly in tune with one another, right? Like, kill them all and let God sort it out. But over time, Athegall starts to learn something about mercy, starts to learn something about tempering it, so that by the time he's arguing with the giant, he's able to defeat the giant with the understanding that you can't just apply the same measure to everybody without any. You've got to be more careful than that. And then we see him starting to rein his Gollum in so that he doesn't just slay everybody because he would. So I think Athegall's on a good trajectory for that, but I also think that he just deeply problematic character, even just at the level of his quest, right? I mean, he's sent by the Faerie Queene for a specific quest that has an expiration date on it, right? I mean, it's time sensitive, and he spends time falling in love and hanging out with his new love, and then he's going in every single thing that's a little bit wrong that he sees along the way. He's got to stop and deal with it to such an extent that he misses his appointment, and the woman he's gone to protect and save is about to be executed, and he only barely gets there in time to stop the execution. And he's like, oh, if only, woe is me that I came too late. It's like, the word you're looking for is not woe, it's blame, actually. Like, stay on target, Athegall.
I mean, I remember, so that's going way back. I've not reread book 5 in over a year, but like, I remember the first time I read that, I was very struck by like, this is a conception of justice that has not been touched by the Enlightenment or any of our modern issues with actually killing people. I mean, like, Athegall would have no problem with corporal punishment, with stocks in the public square, with capital punishment for relatively minor things. I mean, he's he's all about, and to some extent, it's I mean, Lewis talks about this in on the Reading of Old Books. It is one of those moments where I think you're reading it as a modern, and you're like, this is the sea breeze of a different age blowing through my mind. To like see the world in this way is very different than we process justice today. I mean, I don't think we in the 21st century are capable of quite looking at justice in the same with that same rigor simply based on our moment in time. Like we don't think in those ways, but Spenser does, and maybe you're right. Maybe Athegall is supposed to be a more problematic, a more negative figure. He is the Knight of Justice, if I remember correctly. So by title at least, he's kind of put up there as like, this is the question from Plato's Republic. Like, what is justice? It is Athegall. And like, please stay far, far away from me, Athegall. I don't want you to be in charge of my case.
That's right. May God bless and keep Athegall far away from us.
That's it. That is it.
Yeah, and I think he's, I think he's problematic, and I think he's meant to be problematic without being meant to be negative, right?
Sure.
And I think that's true because justice, you talk about maybe the word justice is used in multiple ways, right? If I can channel my inner Aquinas for a moment, because justice is one of it's a virtue, right? It's a cardinal virtue, but it's also, it just describes what actually gets done by the courts, right? And so in that sense, justice being served could actually be unjust.
Sure.
Because it's just a proceeding of the court. And so I think Athegall is meant to represent justice in that larger sense of dealing with a legal problem, a moral problem that has to be redressed. And so he shows the ways in which justice can miscarry. And over time, he's being brought more in line with justice as a transcendent feature of the world rather than justice as administered by a particular government. But even very late in the book, these problems are still there because he is the arm of a particular government, the Queen of Fairyland, Gloriana. And there are still limits in his own self-understanding of how things should go. And this is where the incomplete nature of the poem starts to get us, right?
Yeah.
Because we learn from books 1 through 5, at least, that, just because you reach the end of the book that's about chastity doesn't mean you've reached the end of the story of the knight who represents chastity.
Yep.
And so where we leave Athegall at the end of book 5 is not necessarily where Spenser intended to leave him by the end of book 12, but it is where we have to leave him because we don't know what comes next.
Which, just to clue our audience who maybe have or have not read this, but just to remind everybody, in his letter to Raleigh, Spenser, that's to Sir Walter Raleigh, the namesake of the town I live near, Spenser explains that he is setting forth a book that is all about Aristotelian virtue, and he's going to talk about the 12 virtues, and each book is built around this allegorical core of a virtue. And if you are absolutely committed to an authorial intent hermeneutic, then Spenser's letter to Raleigh is very, very significant and becomes grounds for saying this poem is actually not that great. Because when you go look at it, for starters, Aristotle does not have 12 distinct virtues.
That's right.
Lewis kind of took Spenser to task over that. He thinks that Spenser was probably reading a corrupted version of Aristotle, or maybe had never even read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He might have just heard it referenced and is sort of name dropping there. But this then becomes a great matter of debate among Spenserian scholars, which I don't count myself one of. I'm just going to channel my advisor for a moment. He maintains that it is, in fact, a complete poem. Because book 6 is all about, it's made up of the Cantos of Mutability, and it's all about the dynamic of change, and the complete telos of the book is actually how do you live a virtuous life in a world of change, is kind of Dr. Lockwood's argument. So it sounds, Junius, like you're on the other side of the debate. You see this as an incomplete book, and he died before he could finish even the plot, much less the grand thing that he's trying to say.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think the notion that the plot winds up where he intends it to wind up is pretty hard to get off the ground, not solely based or even primarily based on what he says about the work in letters, but just within the work itself. Like, Arthur never gets to Gloriana's court. That's the telos, as far as the plot goes about the thing. And I can't, I'd never been able to make it work out that he just doesn't mean for that to happen. And this is what he always intended to stop along the way. And I would also say that at the level of the virtues being taught in the thing, what I see across the books that we do have, the 6 books that he did get to write, is an increasing interplay and even perichoresis of the virtues from each of the books with the virtues in the other books. And so, Redcrosse Knight keeps coming back, and Britomart gets as much time outside of her own book on screen as she gets in her own book. And so there's a lot of, I think there's an interweaving that's going on that would have continued and would have reached a fever pitch in book 12 when it would all come together, and only that full flowering of all of the virtues mingling with one another is worthy of representing the court of Gloriana at the end of the book. So I'm on the other side of that one.
So is this where you announce your forthcoming book of you're writing book 12 with all the virtues, the knights, the lords and ladies of virtue at the court of the Faerie Queene?
That one, I think you're going to have to wait to read in the library in heaven, where there's a wing for incompleted works that has the completions of them.
When I was a kid, my mental picture of heaven was a roaring fireplace with endless towering bookshelves and enough time to read all the books and not do my chores. Someday. Yeah, I think it makes sense. And it's one of the things that makes the Faerie Queene really interesting to read, and I think to teach, because it also it's one thing to teach a finished book that we do have an author's kind of statement about the book. I'm in a reading group. We're working through some of William Faulkner's novels, and Faulkner said enough about his own books that we kind of we're meandering and confusingly working our way through them. But eventually, in each one we've read so far, one of us will Google like some article where Faulkner talks about the book, and then it all kind of clicks into place of what he was really trying to do. But without that, it's actually this is kind of an open field for the imagination and for the readers to not. I don't want to go so far as say we construct meaning there. I'm not a reader response guy, but I do think it's a place, particularly for students, to develop their ability to think well about literature and to do that in a book, to a text that invites that kind of thought.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you get the same kind of debate with like Chaucer, where the Canterbury Tales really complete or were they really incomplete? And I tend to come down pretty consistently on the side of the way the author talks about the form of the thing. The Canterbury Tales, I think if they were done, they would have arrived at Canterbury. I can see him stopping halfway, not doing the journey back, but I don't think it was meant to just, stop in the middle like the way that it does. That's not a medieval way of writing. That's a modern way of writing. And so I don't see Chaucer doing that. But then you come forward to someone like Dostoevsky, right? And you've got the 2 greatest novels, The Brothers K and Crime and Punishment. I maintain that Crime and Punishment is his masterwork and not Brothers K, or rather I should say it's the better novel. The reason it's the better novel is because it's done. And I really mean that. It has to be close to as good for that to push it over the top. So that's not the only criterion, but I can talk about Crime and Punishment as a thing, as a definite thing, because it has boundaries. It is finite. And I can say how this aspect relates to that aspect without having to worry about, but would it have related in the same? Is there some piece of information I'm missing? The Brothers K no doubt would have been the better novel had it been completed, but we're limited in our ability to talk about what's really going on with that because we don't know how it was intended to end.
That's fascinating. I'm thinking of a couple summers where I tried to read Brothers K, and I made it about 250 pages in each time. But I did finish Crime and Punishment. So purely on the level of which one I've actually finished reading, I'm inclined to agree with you. But the ability of like what you can say about it, whether it's a part or a whole, that's really interesting. Junius, let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite book of the Faerie Queene to teach? I know you mentioned teaching book 1 several times, but is there one you're like, oh, if I get a chance this is the one I would definitely do.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I do really like teaching book one because I think that the culminating encounter is one of the best in the book, and but at the same time, book one is also the simplest of them. It's the least, but which I mean, it's the least complex of them. And it is, I think the allegorical aspects of book one it's more consistently allegorical than the later books are. And so you could almost get away with calling book one an allegory. And I think that makes it, does make it harder for students and less inherently interesting for students. I think book five is probably the one that I would find myself drawn to, just because it does a really good job of, the allegorical elements are there and they're very rich. You can have a rich discussion about that, but at the level of the plot, there's a lot to talk about there too, right? I don't think that Athegall's delaying getting to his actual quest is primarily an allegorical aspect, but it's primarily a literal thing. And so it gives us room to talk about his character on a very literal level, but also have those same conversations about justice and the problems of justice and the development of his understanding of justice across the book.
Is it book five where we get a sort of catalog of all the rivers in England? Am I remembering that correctly?
I think that's right. 4 or 5, I would say.
I remember hitting that and having the same thought that I have when I in book 2 of the Iliad, where there's the catalog of ships. I'm like, this was incredibly meaningful to someone else.
Not the target audience.
Yeah, that part did not hit me.
I'll tell you what I think it'd be easy to gloss over that I wouldn't recommend glossing over is there's a point where Arthur and Britomart both get to see their genealogies, and you sort of get the story of the British line and the story of the Faerie line, and that's so important because that's what the work is ostensibly really about, is marrying those two things together. And so I think that's actually very fascinating, and especially the constructed history of the kings of Fairyland that he creates is really fascinating.
Oh, there's so many pieces of what Spenser's doing that contemporary fantasy authors still play with those same sorts of ideas and same sorts of tropes. And it's one of the places where I know mid 20th century fantasy as a genre sometimes deservedly got a really bad rap as being very bad literature. But Spenser is doing the same kind of thing in a far more artistically complex way. And I think it really is a way, I suppose, of justifying my favorite genre of literature. But I really do like what Spenser's doing. Last thing I want to ask you about is less from me and more from Lewis, because Lewis taught the Faerie Queene, I believe, at Oxford, maybe at Cambridge. He didn't himself publish his own lectures, but one of his students did. It's published as Spenser's Images of Life. And in there, Lewis goes in great detail analyzing several of the pageant scenes that Spenser sets forth. And we haven't talked too much about those, but I think it's one of the places where Spenser is probably on the line maybe between allegorical and symbolic, because he gives us these usually parades of figures. He does one of the 7 deadly sins. He does one in the Temple of Venus. But in each one, he's really trying to set forth this really complex set of images and ideas, and he's decking them all out and everything that could possibly add to those meanings. So I did want to ask you, do you have a favorite pageant scene in the Faerie Queene that you like analyzing?
Wow, that's a great question. The Temple of Venus pageant is really good. It's so good. I think I'd have to choose that one. Yeah. This pageant thing, this is something that people loved. It was a big deal. It kind of developed in the Middle Ages, and then it died out in the Renaissance. Marlowe, Dr. Faustus, there's a pageant where the various vices are paraded in front of Dr. Faustus, and that's one of the last pageants in major English literature. And in Shakespeare, there's a moment, I feel like the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, after the play is done and the fairies are going through the house and blessing everyone who's there and everything, that has a bit of a pageant feel to me, but I don't recall there being a blatant upfront pageant. Well, no, there is in Macbeth. Because Banquo, I mean, Macbeth sees the Banquo's line, king after king being paraded in front of him. And it goes by very quickly in the reading, but on stage, it's very much a pageant of all of these great kings, which connected back to, in the Aeneid, where you have a pageant of the Roman kings that are going to come from him. So it's one of those things that we just don't really do anymore. And so I think it's very hard for the contemporary mind to get our minds around what's cool about them. But there's this sense of getting to see behind the curtain about the pageant and understanding the way reality really works, and to kind of compare things together, and the idea that they would all present themselves to your view as something that you could then sit back and contemplate, all in proper order. That's very exciting to the medieval and the Renaissance mind. And so coming from that standpoint, I think the pageant in the Temple of Venus is probably the best instance of a pageant in the text as well.
No, I think it's one of the things that I think Lewis takes most clearly from Spenser is not certainly not a formal pageantry in that sense, except that he is inclined to setting forth those same kinds of scenes. There's one in That Hideous Strength in the chapter Descent of the Gods, where you literally get the planets, the governing spirits of all the planets descend, and Lewis gives you parallel paragraphs displaying the effect that the descent has on two different groups of people. But then throughout Narnia, there's all these moments where you're kind of I'm thinking of one particular two. In Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they reach Ramandu's Island, and there is just the table that is set forth, and there are the sleepers, and there's the food, and there's the knife, and it's all displayed. And Lewis manages to craft this atmosphere of meaningfulness there. And he doesn't explain exactly what's going on with the knife. We learn eventually that it's the White Witch's knife, but he doesn't. It's not like we get a long expository paragraph explaining the history of this knife since Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But he just sets this kind of atmosphere of mystery using pageantry. And you see something in a different emotional register, but I think a similar effect at the end of the last battle when you get the reunion scene between all the characters from all these scenes. And it's just this display of all these characters that you've come to know and love over the last 6 books here at the end of all things. And there's one of the places where I think Lewis definitely is. He's been heavily influenced in this way, I think, by Spenser, and he's drawing that attention to display forward into his own writing.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that it's difficult to overstate. Lewis loved Spenser, and he taught Spenser a lot, and he wrote about Spenser, and he is heavily influenced by Spenser. And so once you start reading Spenser, you start recognizing a lot of influences in Lewis. And I wanted to go back to that fantasy genre comment that you made, because it's also probably my favorite genre as well. And if you talk to people, they'll say, well, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien is the father of fantasy and blah blah blah, and you're like, no, Spenser's the father of fantasy. Well, Tolkien's the father of modern fantasy. No, Spenser's the father of modern fantasy. I mean, you can push fantasy back to Ovid's Metamorphoses and things like that if you want to, because you have to just start talking about what differentiates fantasy from mythology. But really, I think in the sense in which we're on about, Tolkien would have laughed at the idea that he was the father of fantasy, and he would have had a long list of things. He could go look at Gormenghast, go look at the King of Elfland's Daughter, go look at some of these other things that even with William Morris, right, that were antecedents that he was drawing from, and he would trace that all the way back through Gothic literature to Spenser. And so you're going to see a lot of important influence on Tolkien in Spenser as well. So this is for if you're like us and you enjoy fantasy literature, or you enjoy stories of fairyland. In book 1, you don't really get the sense of being in fairyland as clearly. It just kind of feels allegorical, like Pilgrim's Progress. But as you get deeper into it, you really do get a strong sense of being in fairyland, and that becomes very meaningful. And to recognize that most of the knights are fairy knights; they're elves. But Britomart's not. Britomart's a British knight, and Arthur is a British knight. And so then you begin to see these differences in how they're situated, and you recognize that the elves they're drawn differently. They have a different level of allegory to them than the Britons do. And that opens up a lot of stuff too. So I really do think this is an important text for those who are students of the fantasy genre.
It's also a text that richly rewards reading and then rereading and then rereading again. I've read through this whole thing once, and I've read through books 1 through 3 a second time. I'm going to be teaching books 1 through 4 next term, so I'll get to go back through those. I got control of the syllabus for this class. I'm very excited about, like, I made all the students buy the big red edition of the Faerie Queene. So, but just each time, I think it reward. You see, it's one of those texts that really belongs in the great books category. In part because it says a lot of true things about human nature, but it just rewards continued attention. I think, Junius, you've demonstrated that for us very well today. I mean, you've clearly spent a lot of time in this poem, and you're seeing a lot of really deep connections in it. So thank you so much for your thoughts today. As we're starting to wrap up, I did want to ask you, what are you teaching next? Are you doing Faerie Queene again? Do you have other classes on the horizon?
I do. I'm not teaching Faerie Queene again. I don't mean I'm never teaching Faerie Queene again. That's not what I mean. I mean, I don't have immediate plans to teach it soon. Because I'm embarking on, I think, my most ambitious teaching project ever. I'm going to teach the Arthurian tradition. And so I'm breaking it up into 2 different 20-week courses, meeting once a week. So in 2026, we'll do the first half of the tradition, which is starting with the historians and the Welsh tales and the Mabinogion, and following that all the way through the 12th century French stories, and sort of ending with the prose Lancelot Grail cycle, which gathers together all of this material that developed really quickly. I mean, in the space of about 20 or 30 years, we went from, there was this one hero called Arthur who was amazing, to Camelot, Round Table, Lancelot, Quest for the Holy Grail, all this stuff. So we'll do that in 2026, and then in 2027 we're going to do the second half of the tradition, which is when the Middle English texts start. So we'll read Malory, and then we'll bring it out of the Middle Ages, and we'll read Tennyson, and we'll read T.H. White, and all of that sort of a thing. So I am super stoked about this because I've never had a chance to teach the tradition like that. And most people don't get a chance to read the tradition. If they're lucky, they read one of these texts. Even among literature majors, there's often not time to do this. So I'm really excited to dig into that. I think it's not just the master myth of the English language. It's also it is such a complicated, convoluted, and rich world, not just in terms of the images and the quests and the plots, but the symbolism. And the what's happening and what the reasons are, what the ambiguities are in Camelot, and the reasons why Camelot can't survive, and then what that says about the subsequent hope of Arthur as a returning king, restoring Camelot, and like what is really going on there theologically. What do we make of all that? So I'm very excited to be doing that, to get a group of students who are committed to just diving into some of the best texts that English and French writers have produced in history.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful project. I did an elective in my graduate work going through the Arthurian tradition, and it was delightful. We read several of those, not everything you mentioned, but several of them, and it is really amazing to watch that story evolve over time and to become contextualized in different communities, and then to see how across the 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries, people still reach for those stories as a way of expressing different truths about their moment. You didn't mention that hideous strength. We talked about Lewis a lot this episode, but Lewis, of course, is also playing in that same space, and it's no accident that he names his positive community Logress, and Ransom's title is the Pendragon, the 79th in descent from Arthur, I believe. And then Merlin, of course, shows up, and I interviewed Holly Ordway about that last season. She had written an article for Davenant Press's volume in the Ransom trilogy about Lewis and the Arthurian tradition, and her argument was that Lewis is very much cherry picking just the things he wants out of this vast tapestry of stories, but that's also what people pretty frequently do. I'll be curious if this is out by the time the second part of your course is happening. I know Malcolm Guite is working on a new poetic edition of the Arthurian saga. So that would be really, I'm really excited. I love Malcolm Guite's work. I'd be really excited to kind of see what he does with those stories.
He and I have been in conversation about that, and we're planning to, we're scheming up some public events we can do to talk about these things together. Because it's very exciting that I'm teaching it right as he's publishing this new version of it. I'm excited to see that as well. And then I am going to be teaching the Ransom trilogy in next summer, and so we will have at least gotten through the first half of the tradition before coming into that. Usually, when I teach the Ransom trilogy, the folks don't know the Arthurian tradition, and so they're like, "What's going on with Maryland and like this Pendragon business and whatnot?" And so it'll be fun to teach it with some folks who actually have know what he's talking about and can have that connection there. And of course, he mentions. Lewis mentions Arthur and that whole situation multiple times in Narnia as well, sort of in passing. It's just in his mind, and it's in the mind of all of his readers, and he knows that, and we've kind of fallen away from that. So it'll be exciting to, again, a lot of the work that I do is trying to help people rediscover the riches of the past. And this is going to be an especially exciting set of riches to try to help people rediscover.
Excellent. Well, just in case any of our listeners today or in a few weeks when we get this episode out on the regular channels want to come join your class, how do they do that?
Head over to academics.juniusjohnson.com, and you can find information about all the courses there and sign up for the mailing list, and we'll keep you posted on all the new developments.
Awesome. Well, listeners and viewers, you heard it here first. There are exciting public events in the works between Dr. Junius Johnson and Malcolm Guite about Arthurian stuff. So that's wonderful to know. Junius, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, and thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us here today on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Junius Johnson of Junius Johnson Academics. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, like it and share it with your network. Help others think great ideas. You can find the show on all the platforms, but primarily on X as @TheOptimisticC3, on Facebook and LinkedIn under my name, Josh Herring, and on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to subscribe to get the next conversation.